Falter-Radio, der Podcast mit Raimund Löw.
Sehr herzlich willkommen, meine Damen und Herren, zum zweiten Teil des Falter-Radios für Samstag, den 19.01.2019. In einem ersten Teil haben wir über Brexit gesprochen und über die Position der Labour Party in dem sich vergrößernden Chaos in der britischen Politik. Jetzt ein Blick weg von London und ein Blick nach Moskau. Wie Russlands Wladimir Putin tickt, das ist eine der großen Fragen der internationalen Politik. Die Besetzung der Krim, der Krieg gegen die Ukraine, die Unterstützung für Donald Trump im letzten amerikanischen Wahlkampf und die russische Hilfe für rechtsextreme Parteien in Europa, das hat den starken Mann in Moskau zu einer Feindfigur im Westen gemacht. Das türkisblaue Österreich gehört dagegen in Europa eher zu den Putin-Verstehern. Was der russische Präsident mit seinem Kurs der Konfrontation bezweckt, das ist unter Experten umstritten. Zu einer führenden Russlandexpertin in den USA gehört Nina Chruschtschowa, die Urenkelin des einstigen sowjetischen Parteichefs Nikita Chruschtschow. Nina Chruschtschowa lehrt Politikwissenschaft an der New School in New York. Sie hat familiäre Verbindungen nach Russland und viele Kontakte in den Kreml. Anfang Jänner hat Nina Chruschtschowa auf Einladung der Bruno-Kreisky-Stiftung in Wien eine Roundtable-Diskussion geführt über Trends und Widersprüche im Russland von heute. Nina Chruschtschowa spricht auch über das Comeback Stalins im heutigen Russland und darüber, wie man sich in der Familie an den Urgroßvater Nikita Chruschtschow erinnert. Ich habe sie gefragt, wie wichtig aus der Perspektive Putins die Unterstützung Trumps im US-Wahlkampf war und was hinter seiner Unterstützung für rechtsextreme Parteien in Europa steckt. Das Gespräch in der Bar eines Wiener Hotels haben wir in englischer Sprache geführt. From Putin's perspective, from Russia's perspective, how important are these interferences, interventions in American politics as well as in European politics?
Well, I think Putin feels that he doesn't do what other countries don't do. He doesn't do what other leaders don't do. And the way he sees it is that everybody interferes in everything. Everybody interferes. You know, Ukraine in 2013, 2014 had the pro-European Union, anti-Russian revolution, if we want to call it that way. And he absolutely believes that it was staged in many ways. It was supported by the West in many ways. And Russia was just pulling a short part of the stick. And he never wants to be in that position again. He never wants to be kind of on the receiving end of this. But Russia is a big country. Russia tends to overdo things generally. It goes all the way. And so it does appear that Russian presence is much larger than anybody else's because Russia is a bigger country than any other country in the world. But the way Putin sees it, he's not doing anything that others don't do. He may do it a little more craftily because, you know, former KGB agent, because Russia does show its muscle, so he may do it slightly more pushily than others. But he believes that the interference is just leveling the playing field because the West already does it or has done it. He's done it with the Soviet Union at the end of the Soviet Union. He's done it in the 90s with Boris Yeltsin, sort of pushing it towards chaotic capitalism at the expense of Russian real interests. So he sees himself in some ways as a victim of the West. And he believes it's just the West's hypocrisy that the West doesn't want to recognize that Russia has the right or should have the right to do the same thing that the West does.
What did Putin get out of his intervention in America?
Well, I mean, first of all, the way America reports Russia intervened is not how Russia intervened. Russia is a chaotic country. Russia doesn't have a strategic plan that on page 260, we intervene in American elections to support Trump. There's no such thing. There's really no a list of A, B, C, D.
But they had been supporting Trump, hadn't they?
Well, I am of a school of thought that when Russians meddled, I'm not really saying they intervened, when Russians tried to find ways of having better relationship or having better future with the United States in the next, after 2016, a lot of it, I mean, I don't think anybody believed, including Putin, that Trump was going to win. All this so-called support, all this interference, or all this kind of influence of either small or a larger way, the way you want to see it, was more...
Thousands of people sending emails and intervening.
It's not even thousands of people, it's actually bots. Yeah. So you create a bot and then it sends. So it's not like there were thousands of people actually doing that. It was
but in this factory in Petersburg, there were a lot of people.
No, there were 14 people, 20 people, so they create
not
bots.
Thousands.
Right, no. You create bots and you do that, and another thing, you believe that in fact, the West does it, so we're just going to learn their technique to do the same thing to them as they do to us. So once again, I think what Putin is seeing all the time is that everybody does it. It's just, why is Putin always a bad guy? I mean, Netanyahu does it, but that's okay. Erdogan would do it, but nobody would report on Turkey. And the minute Russia sneezes or Putin sneezes, woohoo, great story. Nobody believed that Trump would win, including Putin. I mean, he's not suicidal. It was undermining, all of this was to undermine Hillary Clinton, is not to elect Trump. Yes, of course, there were Zhirinovskys and all these other kind of slightly show-offy lunatics of Russian politics. They're deliberately lunatics of Russian politics, like Zhirinovsky. They would be screaming, oh, boo-hoo, Trump. But Putin never screamed boo-hoo, Trump. He was very calm and sort of saying, well, he's a bright man, he's an interesting man and whatnot. He recently said, I was hoping that Trump would win, but this is all after the fact. We actually don't know what he was hoping to do. So I think for him it was more not to elect Trump, but to show Americans that they're as bastards as everybody else, including him, and they are hypocritical, hubris-driven people. Politicians. And I think that was much more is to show that your crap democracy is crap democracy. What kind of a democracy is this when it says I'm the strongest democracy in the world and it can be shaken so easily? So I think that was his major objective. It really was not to elect Trump. I think because Russia always goes too far and always does too many things, it backfired. But I also think that for Putin, all of it is such a KGB game, kind of the John le Carré novel, as you do one thing. So in some ways, he doesn't even think that it's bad for Russia because it only allows him to show more strength, to show more craftiness. And that gives him certain superiority, he can screw the world.
How about Europe? Is there similar logic behind this alliance with far-right parties in Europe? A lot of money for Marine Le Pen, good relations with the Freedom Party, the Freie FPÖ in Austria, and so on and so far. Is that a similar logic just to show how weak Europe is?
Well, I think that Putin feels that he didn't get a fair shake from the democratic Europe, from people like Tony Blair, from people like, to some degree, Angela Merkel. And so he feels that if he can show what he can do and have Europe, not in his image, because it's not in his image, but have Europe that is more sympathetic to him because he feels that the other Europe, the democratic Europe, it's once again full of hypocrisy and hubris, and Russia is being sidelined for no reason whatsoever. He's looking for alliances where he can. He doesn't want a fascist Europe. I mean,
But maybe he wants to break up the European Union. That's the feeling among many people in Europe.
No, I mean, yes. And I would, if I were Garry Kasparov, I would say yes, because it's a doomsday scenario, and Putin is seen by everybody as this Darth Vader of, the Star Wars horrible anti-hero, the anti-James Bond villain. I don't see him that way. I think it's more of a performance for him. He wants to be recognized in Europe. He feels that if he's a rogue state or roguish state, it's not by his choice. It's because he's cornered, and he's made to be this way. It's sort of kind of the criminal mind's Hollywood behavior is that, well, if you tell a criminal that he's going to be a criminal, it's like, why? You just made me do it. I didn't want to do it, but you keep telling me how horrible I am. So I think breaking Europe is too big of a unpredictability. Broken Europe is too unpredictable. But Europe with allies, and Europe that is not monolithic in kind of saying to Putin, well, you're bad just because Russia is always bad, like kind of an Applebaum argument, Russia is always bad, is something that he'd like. So for him, I believe this is more leverage than breaking up. He's looking for leverage rather than dissolution of Europe.
But I mean, there is a pattern of Russians supporting far-right parties, yes, nationalist parties who actually want to weaken or even to break up the European Union.
But once again, Putin's response to this, I'm not Putin, I'm just thinking that Putin's response might be to this, is that, but that's, again, your problem. I mean, you keep lecturing us on democracy. Look at you. You have all these parties that, in fact, stronger than others, suddenly got into mainstream politics. He's looking at Viktor Orban, who is big friends with him, or wants to be him, and says, wait a minute, this is in Europe. I mean, you're lecturing me. I'm sure he keeps feeling that everybody plays a dirty game, but only he is being taken into account for it. And I think with Austria also it's a country that, I mean, Angela Merkel is lost to him to some degree. But Austria is a country that he understands and knows. He speaks the language very well. Conservative government incoming, much better for him than a non-conservative government. And I think that, for example, everybody was obsessed with that story when he went dancing at a wedding.
The foreign minister,
right,
Kneissl.
Foreign minister. And for me, it makes perfect sense because for him, it was to show that he's accepted in the West. He's invited to a wedding. I mean, it's a little awkward because he's not a man of the people, really. He's not a populist in the way we understand populists because he doesn't really like people in many ways. He likes performances, but he's not a populist in that sense. So he went there, but I also think that because he's been around for so long, he does all the kind of populist moves. But I think at this point he sometimes miscalculates how they look because if it were Germany and Angela Merkel's wedding, that would be a coup. But it was foreign minister in small Austria, no offense to Austria, so it does look a little ridiculous that the big Russia goes to dance at that.
But I think, was it seen like that in Russia?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of things that Putin does now is not even registered in Russia. It's more, I mean, a lot of these performances are not for us. A lot of it is for you. And most
for the West.
For the West. I mean, that bare-chesting that he goes around every summer, we don't care. I mean, I think it was interesting at the beginning, the first time he did it, when he had slightly better boobs and, the kind of chest was younger. And it was impressive after old and drunk Yeltsin all the time. So it was interesting, but after 1-2 times, whatever. I mean, Putin is posing again. And I think he did this in Austria for the audience, and I think he slightly miscalculated because it was uneven, kind of the leverage of big Putin, Russia, and sort of a smaller country with the conservative.
So it didn't really help him in Russia?
Didn't.
Well, he didn't need, maybe.
Well, I mean, in Russia, it didn't help him. Just look, fine, you can hang out with the West. I mean, big deal. But it was one of those kind of miscalculations.
But isn't it that the hope in the Kremlin would be that then, Austria would start an initiative to get rid of the sanctions that were initiated after the occupation of the Crimea, and that these pro-Russian governments, like the Italian government and so on, they change the sanction situation, and there must be a disappointment because as there is no movement on Crimea and on Ukraine, there is hardly anything happening on the sanctions level.
I think at the beginning, when sanctions happened, it was, and I mean, Zaman was saying we don't need sanction Russia. I think even the previous Austrian government was not happy about this. I think the Irish didn't want the sanctions. So it wasn't, Europe was never, despite whatever they say, was never united on this.
Yeah, but they're implemented in their function.
It was never united, and Austria was always saying, we don't need it and whatnot. So yes, absolutely. So I think by then, I don't really believe that Russia really expects those sanctions to be lifted. So I don't think that dance was supposed to. I mean, I'm sure maybe somebody said to Putin, maybe they will do it. But I don't really think that the Kremlin doesn't believe the West at all. Fine, you're not united, but you're still going to, I think the way he thinks about it, you're not united, you're still going to screw me over. It's been 5 years, we adjusted to that, go to hell. If you talk to the Russians or the Russian politicians, and I have some sources up there at the Kremlin, high enough, they said, no, the sanctions would never be lifted because even if we have good relationship.
Let me ask you about the situation of Russian society, and Putin is in power since such a long time. And there had been ups and downs of civil society, there had been demonstrations. There's always, in Moscow and big cities, there had been an important civil society. And we see in some parts of Eastern Europe, we see a resurgence of civil society, in Hungary, even in Poland. How about civil society in Russia, in the cities? Is it dead or could it come back?
First of all, he was very clever, leaving in 2008. So he is in power for 18 years, but he also was not in power for 4 years. So it's not the same as Brezhnev already. Although, yes, has been for a long time. They've been clamping down on demonstrations, but they're still happening. It's not that you can't go and demonstrate. Of course you can. It's not as simple, it's not as easy, but it's happening. What they're afraid of mostly is Navalny, because Navalny is a big story. That's why he's immediately arrested.
He's the opposition leader
the lawyer,
against
anti-corruption.
Big anti-corruption
guy. Right, exactly. So they don't want him to flicker, so they arrest him right away. But others, they don't really pay attention because Putin is a gambler, but he's a very careful one. I mean, for example, one's like, he's going to take over Ukraine. Never. Because he knows he never does something that he thinks he cannot swallow. And he knows that he can take Crimea, but Ukraine, he can't swallow. He's just going to break his teeth. He went a little far with East Ukraine because they miscalculated. They thought that part of Donetsk, Lugansk, Mariupol, Odessa, it's just so feeling Russian would go. And they didn't. And I think that was a good lesson for him. So all his movements are very clever. So Navalny is a big story. So Navalny is out. But smaller things, as you know, there were regional elections just happened in November. And those regional elections were quite a fight back, because people were voting against Putin. He was not on the ballot, but they were voting against United Russia. So all these great candidates that United Russia was putting in were voted out. Not all, 3 of them only, but it's enough.
Yeah, what does it mean? It means that there were anti-Putin people who were voted in?
Well, communists were voted in. So United Russia had its own candidates, and people voted against the United Russia candidates. So this is a movement that is already happening. They've been kind of local demonstrations. So I wouldn't say it died down, the protests, but Russians are terrified of revolutions. Russians are very much the country that went through so much instability. Those kind of great examples of the yellow vests in France are not going to be the Russian example. I think in Russian it would be this kind of aspects of civil society, people against the ecological disasters. People against, exactly. Well, actually, I was surprised how pensioners, that pension system, how they did not, everybody was like, the pensioners are just going to sweep with demonstrations. They didn't. People bitched. People elected communists in some places, but no, it didn't happen. But I think that the more sanctions go and the more economy goes worse, and the more young people see that there is fewer opportunities in Russia because Putin is staying longer and longer, I think the more it's going to be spread in small pockets, which eventually may turn into something big.
How important is fear among society, among the people for Putin's reign?
It's not the same fear as it was in the Soviet Union, because in the Soviet Union it was a complete fear. I mean, you're basically afraid of everything. Now it's...
Gorbachev took that fear away.
In Putin, it's a small fear. It's not a fear of gulag. It's not a fear of prosecution. It's not a fear of a mental institution you're going to be put in because you say Brezhnev is an idiot. It's a fear of small losses. You have a good job, and if you are not doing the right thing, you may lose that job. You have a vacation in Italy, and if you are not obedient, they're going to take your visa away or something. It doesn't make Russia a closed society, but it makes Russia a controlled society. Kind of the same thing with the press. It's self-censorship. It's not forbidden. Nothing is forbidden. You can do anything. But it's self-censorship just in case. We're not going to do that. We're not going to say it. We're not going to write it. We're not going to show it, because then something might happen. But the interesting thing is, what I noticed, I actually just wrote an article about this, is that political big stories are controlled by the Kremlin, and the outlets, either written, the newspapers or TV, they don't write about, patriotism is important, anti-Navalny is important. But those social issues like pensions, like small salaries, like economic opportunities, sort of the social aspects of Russian life, being reported as if they're reported by glasnost. I mean, it really is like, oh my God, look at this. No opportunity unless you give a vzyatka, if you give a bribe to whoever. And you almost, when you look at social articles versus political articles or nationalistic articles against the West, it's like, wait a minute, who was it? Anti-Putin's conspiracy. So that are also part of kind of the civil society developing, because alarmism in social issues very present in the contemporary Russian press, and not fear.
Fear under Stalinism, fear in the Soviet Union was of a different category. I'd like to ask you about your great-grandfather, who was Nikita Chruschtschow, who was the first to took away part of the fear from Stalin. How is he seen today in Russia? Because for the leftists in the West, well, he's remembered as the person who on the 20th Party Congress accused Stalin of all of the crimes of Stalin. Is that part of the historic memory of Russia today?
In a strange way, yes. But not necessarily in a positive way. But that's sort of Russia, is that, one part of it is Kaliningrad, former Königsberg, and another part of it is essentially on the border with Japan. So it's kind of split personality of it. So, because Stalin is a hero in Putin's Russia. I mean, Putin himself necessarily didn't say, I love Stalin, but Stalin returned with a vengeance, I'd say, because as you may know, there was a subway station, metro station, has the Soviet anthem, right, emblazoned on the new renovated station, Kurskaya. So it's there. Textbooks mention Stalin and say, well, he's a good manager. I mean, he really needed to do it because the West was out to get the Soviet Union. He's popular because people say, well, there was order, and it was important. The World War II is celebrated like, the greatest thing that ever happened to this country. So in some ways, Stalin is in fashion, and not necessarily in a Kremlin doesn't have a banner saying "Great Stalin," but he is Great Stalin. I mean, last year I went through the whole Russia, and I would see there's amazing references to him. I mean, every museum has exhibits of Stalin. You pass through Perm, which is a city in the Urals, and it has a Gulag museum. And just, 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers away from the Gulag museum, there is a bus station saying, "Long live the great Stalin," on the banner, just put on a bus station. So you just drive through, it's like, oh, great. which are we mourning the Gulag or we're celebrating Stalin? So in this sense, Stalin exists. And if Stalin exists, Khrushchev also exists, because he was the one who took him down. So he exists as a kind of negative character. But in a strange way, he also fell out of history, because since we celebrate Stalin, we really don't celebrate Khrushchev. We only mention Khrushchev in negative terms once in a while, because he just, who was he to take that great man down? Putin mentioned Khrushchev a number of times in a negative way once again, because of Crimea, of course, we know that. But at the same time, in 2010, there was an exhibition on Khrushchev in the Manege, which seemed, in 2010, so it was Medvedev years, it seemed that, I knew Putin was coming back in 2012, but there was a hope that he may not. And it seemed like my mother, for example, saw it as a sign. So in 2010, there's a Khrushchev exhibition. In 2012, Putin is not going to come back, so Russia would become democratic. But it's Russia. It's kind of the double eagle. You move one, you move another. Now there was certain interviews with certain historians on Echo Moskva. You know what Echo Moskva is?
Like a radio station.
Radio station, sort of liberal radio station. And it was an explanation why turning the Constitution and changing the Constitution, and why Khrushchev did certain things with the Constitution and whatnot, why these things were so important. So there are references in negative and there's a positive. So societal references to Khrushchev are positive. Political references are negative. How it's going to play out, I don't know. I don't think that in the near future Khrushchev is going to be a big hero in Russia, because all these reformers like Khrushchev, like Gorbachev, like Yeltsin with all his imperfections, they're really not heroes in the Russian strong hand formula, for example.
But they gave freedom to the people.
But Russians don't really, that's what I said. Russians, expecting Russia, the Arab Spring is not going to happen. Russians don't want freedom. They're afraid of freedom. Freedom never worked for them. I'm not saying Russia is undemocratic. That's not what I'm saying. It really never worked for them the way we think it should work. It's too big. How do you free the 11 time zones? You free something and something else goes bad.
When you were in Moscow, you go to the cemetery where Khrushchev is buried. Is it still maintained and orderly?
Very orderly, very, very nice, and people come in. A lot of people come in. He's lucky that he wasn't buried next to the Kremlin wall, because he would be probably defamed all the time. But there, people come in, they feel it's an important political statement. There are always flowers that are not necessarily brought by us, but by just people thanking him and thanking for their families that he freed from Gulag. So once again, societal response is positive, political response is not.
How is he remembered in the history of your family?
Well, he's a historic personality, but he's also a family personality. So it's the remembrances that, he was a great man who made mistakes. He made big mistakes, but he also a great man because he admitted those mistakes at the end of his life, maybe a little too late. For example, my mother was telling me a story how, in fact, I actually even remember that, which I don't understand how, but somehow I do. I was very young. In 1968, when the tanks were going to Prague, and Khrushchev was a big farmer. He grew some tomatoes that he was very proud of, and he just didn't want to pick them, and he wanted to keep them until they grow into some remarkable Guinness record book tomatoes. And so it was a early frost, and that's when the tanks went into Czechoslovakia, and he saw his tomatoes dead the same night. And so for him it was he was heartbroken for the tomatoes, and he was going through this dead vines and said, what a horrible day in the world and in nature. And came back into the house, and he said, it has been 12 years and we haven't learned a better way. And he was referring to his 1956, and so the Soviets sent again tanks to oppress another in other nations. So he was repenting. I mean, he was saying that he shouldn't have told Pasternak how to write Dr. Zhivago. He felt that as a politician, as a political leader, it wasn't his job to tell everybody what to do and how to do it.
Das war die amerikanische Russlandexpertin Nina Chruschtschowa, die als Urenkelin des einstigen sowjetischen Parteiführers Nikita Chruschtschow über viele Fäden in Richtung Russland verbunden ist. Ich verabschiede mich von den Hörern, die auf UKW dabei sind, im Freirad Tirol und auf Radio Agora in Kärnten. Analysen zu den gefährlichen Krisen am Rande Europas finden sich jede Woche auch im Falter. Ein Abonnement des Falter kann man online bestellen. Das funktioniert über die Internetseite abo.falter.at. Ursula Winterauer hat die Signation gestaltet. Anna Goldenberg betreut die Technik. Ich verabschiede mich bis zur nächsten Folge.
Sie hörten das Falterradio, den Podcast mit Raimund Löw.